A royal message was meant to reach its destination, but the messenger vanished, and the secret he carried disappeared with him. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. I always love seeing where our mystery community gathers. Your presence makes every story more special. Now, let's uncover the forgotten secret. The morning upon which this singular affair first entered our lives was one of those pale London mornings in late October, when the fog did not merely drift through Baker Street, but seemed to possess an intelligence of its own. It curled about every lamppost, muffled the clatter of hansom cabs, and transformed familiar streets into uncertain passages between worlds. The city breathed in whispers, concealing both honest men and rogues beneath the same grey veil. Sherlock Holmes sat motionless in his armchair before the fire, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while the remains of an untouched breakfast rested upon the table beside him. To any casual observer he might have appeared idle, yet I had long since learned that such stillness was merely the outward sign of extraordinary mental activity. The faintest interruption could either irritate him beyond measure, or awaken that fierce energy which only the promise of an unusual problem could inspire. I had scarcely folded the morning edition of the Times when Holmes spoke. "You have overlooked the most interesting paragraph, Watson. I believe I have read every page." "Read, certainly. Observed, no." Without lifting his eyes, he extended a thin hand toward the newspaper. "The third page, lower right column." I searched the indicated place until a brief report caught my attention. "Mysterious death, near Whitehall. The unidentified body of a gentleman was discovered shortly after midnight in a narrow lane adjoining Whitehall. No valuables were found upon the deceased, whose clothing, though of excellent quality, bore neither tailor's mark nor identifying papers. Scotland Yard has begun an investigation but has released no further particulars." "It is little more than a routine report," I remarked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly why it deserves attention. You astonish me. My dear Watson, newspapers devote columns to ordinary murders, and scarcely a sentence to extraordinary ones. When facts are withheld, someone wishes them withheld." Before I could pursue the matter, Mrs. Hudson entered carrying the Morning Post. "3 letters, Mr. Holmes." He glanced at them briefly. "A solicitor." He placed one aside. "A publisher requesting an opinion upon some absurd monograph." A second joined the first. And finally, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. "This is curious." The envelope was fashioned from unusually heavy cream paper, embossed with a royal crest, so delicately impressed that it could scarcely be seen except when held toward the firelight. There was no sender's name. Holmes broke the seal. As his eyes traveled across the page, the amusement vanished entirely. Without a word, he handed the letter to me. It was written in a firm, elegant hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I request your immediate assistance in a matter of the utmost discretion. I regret that I cannot commit the particulars to writing. A gentleman will arrive within the hour to conduct you to my residence. The affair concerns not merely the death reported this morning, but circumstances which, if mishandled, may prove deeply embarrassing to the Crown. I trust entirely in your reputation for silence. Edmund Ashcombe." I looked up. "The Crown, so our correspondent believes. You know him?" "No, but the crest may be genuine, may be borrowed." Holmes rose at last and crossed to the window. "The paper originates from a stationer, patronized by government offices. The ink is French. The writer possesses an educated hand but hesitated twice before signing his surname." "You observed all that already. It was difficult not to." He turned, his eyes bright with the familiar excitement I had come to cherish. "Tell me, Watson, what do you infer?" I examined the letter once more. "That Mr. Ashcombe enjoys influence. Reasonable. That he fears public scandal. Likely. And that the murdered gentleman was somehow connected with government affairs." Holmes inclined his head. "An excellent beginning. I confess I felt no little satisfaction." He continued. "Now permit me to spoil it." He took the sheet from my hand. "The folds indicate that the letter was written before dawn. The writer expected us to receive it before breakfast. Therefore, the death reported in the newspaper cannot have been his original reason for contacting me. Rather, the newspaper confirmed his worst fear. You mean he anticipated something? Holmes tapped the signature. And Mr. Edmund Ashcombe has spent a thoroughly miserable night. Before I could frame another question, footsteps echoed rapidly upon the staircase. Mrs. Hudson appeared once more. "A gentleman to see you, sir." "Show him in." Our visitor entered with an air of restrained urgency. He was a tall man, nearing 60, impeccably dressed in dark mourning clothes. Silver streaked his temples, while his clean-shaven face bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged anxiety, rather than advancing age. His gloves were immaculate, yet one button of his overcoat had been fastened incorrectly, a trivial disorder which suggested unusual haste. Holmes observed it instantly. "You left home within 5 minutes of receiving unexpected news." The gentleman halted. "I beg your pardon?" "You dressed in darkness or distraction. The second button has replaced the third." The man glanced downward in surprise. "I had not noticed." "No. Nor, I imagine, did your valet." "My valet is away, so I had supposed." Our visitor stared. "I begin to understand your reputation, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "You are Mr. Edmund Ashcombe." "I am, and you have come regarding the unidentified gentleman discovered near Whitehall." Ashcombe's face paled. "Then, you already know." "I know almost nothing, which is why I hope you intend to improve the situation." The visitor lowered himself into the chair. "I scarcely know where to begin." "Begin at the beginning." Ashcombe hesitated before speaking. "For 27 years, I have served in various confidential capacities within His Majesty's government." Holmes remained expressionless. "I require no official names." "Thank you." Ashcombe drew a slow breath. 3 days ago, an elderly gentleman arrived in London under the strictest secrecy. He carried no luggage beyond a leather dispatch case, secured by an unusual brass lock. Holmes leaned forward. "And his name?" "I cannot tell you." "You do not know?" "I know, but cannot say." "Precisely." Holmes accepted this without protest. The gentleman was expected to deliver a private communication directly into royal hands. The message was considered of such importance that no written record exists outside the document itself. "And now?" I asked. Ashcombe closed his eyes briefly. "Now the messenger is dead." A heavy silence settled over the room. Holmes broke it quietly. "The dispatch case, missing. And the message, missing. No witnesses? None. Enemies? We cannot determine." Holmes paced slowly before the fire. "Interesting." Ashcombe looked almost offended. "Interesting. Sir, if that document should fall into unsuitable hands—" "I appreciate the gravity," Holmes interrupted with unexpected sharpness. "But gravity does not produce clarity." He turned suddenly. "The dead man was not robbed." Ashcombe blinked. "What makes you say so?" "Because the newspapers specifically mention the absence of valuables." "They do. If his purse, watch, rings, and money had been stolen, the report would have stated robbery. Instead, it carefully says no valuables were found." "You believe they were removed afterward?" "I believe someone wished the body to appear robbed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A subtle distinction. Ashcombe stared in growing amazement. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, Scotland Yard has reached precisely the opposite conclusion." "So much the worse for Scotland Yard." At that instant, another knock sounded below. A moment later, a familiar voice called from the staircase. "Mr. Holmes!" Inspector Lestrade entered with his usual brisk manner, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "I might have guessed I'd find you already involved." Holmes smiled. "My dear Lestrade, you've heard about Whitehall." "We have heard very little." Lestrade glanced toward Ashcombe, recognizing him instantly. "Ah." The inspector's expression became markedly more cautious. "I see." Holmes watched them both. "It appears everyone knows everyone except myself." Lestrade cleared his throat. "The Yard has been instructed to exercise unusual discretion, which generally means someone important is frightened." "I didn't say that." "You needn't." The inspector produced a small evidence envelope from his pocket. "We found one curious item." Holmes accepted it carefully. Inside lay a tarnished silver button no larger than a farthing. Upon its surface was engraved an intricate design, a crowned lion above a small messenger's horn. Holmes studied it beneath the light. His eyes, which moments before had seemed merely interested, suddenly sharpened with unmistakable intensity. For the first time since the affair had begun, I saw genuine surprise upon his face. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "You recognize it?" asked Lestrade. Holmes slowly closed the envelope. "Perhaps. What does it mean?" Holmes looked toward the window, where the London fog had thickened, until Baker Street itself had vanished from sight. "It means, gentlemen, that the dead man may not have been carrying the king's message." He paused. "He may have been the king's last forgotten messenger." Lestrade's narrow face tightened with impatience. "That sounds very dramatic, Holmes, but I should prefer something a little more useful." Holmes did not answer at once. He turned the envelope between his fingers, studying the tarnished button from several angles before carrying it to the chemical table near the window. With a pair of forceps, he removed it and held it above the flame of a spirit lamp. A faint, oily gleam appeared around the engraved horn. "Where precisely was this found?" he asked. "Beneath the dead man's left shoulder. Attached to the coat?" "No. Loose upon the ground." "And the body had been moved?" Lestrade hesitated. "We cannot say for certain." "Then you can say for certain that it had." The inspector frowned. "How do you arrive at that?" Holmes lowered the button. A loose object beneath the shoulder could not have fallen there while the body lay flat. Either it was placed there deliberately, or the corpse was rolled over after the object had fallen. Ashcombe leaned forward. "Placed there? As a warning?" "Possibly. As an identification, more probably." Holmes rubbed the engraved surface with a clean cloth. A dark residue stained the fabric. "Lamp black," said he, "mixed with wax." Lestrade stared. "What does that tell us?" "That this button was recently pressed into a seal." I looked again at the curious emblem. A button used as a seal. "An improvised stamp, Watson. Observe the softened wax lodged within the deeper cuts. Whoever carried it had lately used it to impress the crowned lion and horn upon a document or packet." Ashcombe's composure faltered. "The message, perhaps." Holmes returned the button to its envelope. "You called this man the king's forgotten messenger. What did you mean?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes resumed his place before the fire. "The badge belongs to no present royal department. The crowned lion above a post horn was once associated with a confidential courier service established during the final years of the Napoleonic Wars. Its agents traveled outside the ordinary diplomatic system. Their identities were known only to a small circle within the government." Ashcombe stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "My brother once mentioned the service in connection with an 18th century cipher. He believed it had ceased to exist before Queen Victoria came to the throne." "It did," said Ashcombe quietly. "Officially." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Ah." For several moments, only the crackling of the fire disturbed the silence. Lestrade looked from one man to the other. "You mean to tell me that a secret courier organization has survived for nearly a century without the Yard knowing of it?" Ashcombe's expression became cold. "The Yard is not informed of every instrument used in the service of the Crown." "No," said Holmes. "Only of those which fail." The official ignored the remark. The office was dissolved publicly in 1837. Privately, a single position remained. One courier, appointed for life, was entrusted with matters too sensitive for embassies, ministers, or telegraph clerks. When he died, another was selected. "And the dead man was the present holder?" I asked. Ashcombe's silence answered me. Holmes reached for his coat. "We must see the body." Lestrade shook his head. "The mortuary is under guard. Then your guards may enjoy the unusual experience of admitting someone useful." A short while later, we were rattling through the fog in a four-wheeler. Lestrade sat opposite Holmes, while Ashcombe had departed separately to send what he described as an urgent communication. His refusal to accompany us did not escape my friend's attention. "You distrust him," I said, when the cab had turned into Oxford Street. "I distrust every man who brings me half a fact and asks for the whole truth." But he appeared genuinely alarmed. Alarm is no proof of innocence, Watson. It is often merely proof of involvement. Lestrade gave a dry laugh. You suspect everyone before breakfast. Only those who deserve it. The body had been taken to a discreet police facility behind a magistrate's office near Westminster. We were admitted through a side entrance and led into a cold, whitewashed room where the dead man lay beneath a coarse sheet. Lestrade drew it back. The deceased was elderly, perhaps 70, though the fine structure of his face suggested that age had diminished neither strength nor dignity. His silver hair was closely cut, and a thin scar crossed his right temple. There were no visible wounds apart from a dark mark below the left ear. Holmes bent over him. Cause of death? Strangulation, according to the surgeon. No. Lestrade stiffened. The surgeon was quite clear. The surgeon was quite wrong. Holmes lifted the dead man's chin and examined the mark through his lens. This bruise was made after death. How can you tell? There is little swelling and no broken tissue beneath it. The skin was compressed to suggest a cord, but the blood had already ceased to circulate. Then what killed him? Holmes opened one eyelid, examined the pupil, and then bent close to the dead man's lips. He next inspected the fingertips and nails. Poison? I suggested. Not in the common sense. He turned the left-hand palm upward. Between the thumb and forefinger lay a tiny puncture, nearly invisible. A needle, said Lestrade. A hollow needle. Holmes sniffed the cuff of the dead man's sleeve. Bitter almonds? I asked. No, something less obvious. From his pocket, he produced a small vial and scraped beneath one fingernail. A grayish powder collected upon the glass. Metal dust, he murmured. Lestrade crossed his arms. You will tell us, I suppose, when you have finished performing miracles. Holmes ignored him and inspected the dead man's boots. The soles were damp, though the edges carried a fine reddish grit. Where was the body found? In Crown Passage, behind Whitehall, paved with stone. Yes. No exposed earth? None. Holmes pointed to the boots. Then he did not die there. He next examined the trousers and removed a pale thread caught near the knee. Blue wool, I observed, dyed with indigo and mixed with horsehair, from carriage upholstery. So he was transported in a cab, said Lestrade. No ordinary cab. The thread is too fine, and the horsehair reinforcement is found chiefly in private state carriages or old diplomatic coaches. The inspector's skepticism began to fade. Holmes turned suddenly to the dead man's right ear. Lodged within it was a minuscule flake of white material. He removed it with the tip of a pin and placed it upon his thumbnail. Plaster, I said. Not plaster. Sealing compound. He crushed it gently. Chalk, resin, and powdered shell. His face grew grave. Watson, do you recall the stain upon the button? The black wax? Yes. The messenger sealed something shortly before his death. Yet this white compound came from a seal that was broken close enough to him for a fragment to enter his ear. Lestrade stared at the body. Someone opened the dispatch while he was alive. Precisely. And killed him afterward. Not immediately. Holmes moved to the dead man's coat, which lay folded upon a nearby table. He searched each pocket, then examined the lining. At the inner seam his fingers paused. There has been a repair. He slit 2 stitches with his penknife and drew out a narrow strip of paper, rolled tightly and concealed within the padding. Lestrade exclaimed with triumph. The message! But Holmes unrolled it and held it to the light. The strip was blank except for a single line written in faded brown ink. The lion carries no crown when the 3rd bell sounds. Beneath the words was the imprint of the messenger's horn, pressed in black wax. Holmes's expression became utterly still. A cipher? I asked. No, Watson. He looked toward the shrouded windows as the distant chimes of Westminster sounded the quarter hour. It is an instruction. To whom? Holmes folded the strip carefully. To the man who murdered him, and who has not yet completed his task. Lestrade took a step nearer. Then we must discover what the 3rd bell means. Holmes slipped the paper into his pocketbook. We must first discover which bell. There are hundreds in London. Precisely. A useful instruction is one understood by its intended recipient and meaningless to everyone else. He returned to the dead man's coat and examined the empty buttonholes, cuffs, and collar with renewed attention. At last he drew a small measuring rule from his pocket and compared the spacing along the front. "One button is missing." "The silver one?" I asked. "No. That object never belonged to this coat. These buttons are horn, and the missing one was cut away recently." He indicated a thread hanging from the second buttonhole. Not torn in a struggle, severed cleanly. Lestrade bent over it. Why would anyone take an ordinary coat button? Because it was not ordinary. Holmes turned the garment inside out. Beneath the missing button, almost invisible against the dark lining, was a small circular impression. "Something flat had been sewn behind it," said I. "A wafer of metal, most likely, thin enough to escape notice. The real message? Or the means of reading it?" Holmes covered the body once more and moved toward the door. "We have learned all this room can tell us." "And where do you propose to go?" asked Lestrade. "To the place where he died. You said Crown Passage was not the place." "Exactly." Outside, the fog had thinned into a cold drizzle. Holmes stood beneath the archway, his face lifted as though the wet air itself carried evidence. "The boots bear red grit," he said. "The carriage contained indigo wool and horsehair. The victim was exposed to sealing compound made with powdered shell. Which establishments near Whitehall combine an old private carriage, red gravel, and rooms where official seals are used?" Lestrade considered. "Government offices? Too many. A foreign embassy? Better." I recalled Ashcombe's guarded account. The messenger arrived secretly from abroad. Holmes nodded. "And if he carried a document dangerous to the Crown, the likeliest place to intercept him would be somewhere that appeared protected." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "There is the old Valdarian legation in Belgrave Square. It has stood mostly empty since diplomatic relations were suspended." "Mostly?" asked Holmes. "A caretaker and 2 clerks remain." "Does it possess a carriage entrance?" "Yes. And a courtyard, with red gravel." Holmes's thin face brightened. "Then we shall visit Belgrave Square." The old legation was a somber stone building, set behind iron railings blackened by weather. 2 carved lions flanked the doorway, though the crown above one had broken away, leaving only rusted pins in the stone. Holmes stopped abruptly. "The lion carries no crown," I murmured. "At the 3rd bell," he replied. Lestrade glanced up. "You think this is the place?" "I think someone wished the recipient to think so." We were admitted by a stooping caretaker named Abel Voss, whose heavy eyelids and stooped shoulders suggested age, though his hands were broad and powerful. He denied that any visitor had entered during the previous night. "The gates were locked at 10, he insisted. "I heard nothing until morning." Holmes's gaze fell upon his boots. "You crossed the courtyard before dawn." Voss stiffened. "I always inspect the gates." "In slippers?" The caretaker looked down. Fine red grit clung to the edges of his polished shoes. "I changed footwear, but not before walking through spilled lamp oil." Holmes pointed to a dark smear near the heel. Voss's face lost color. Lestrade moved forward, but Holmes raised a hand. "You need not arrest him. He is frightened, not guilty." The caretaker sagged against the wall. "They told me no harm would come to him." "Who told you?" Voss shook his head desperately. "I never saw his face. He came 3 nights ago with a written order bearing the proper seal. I was to leave the carriage gate unlatched after midnight and ring the service bell 3 times when the courier arrived." "The 3rd bell," said Lestrade. "What happened then?" Holmes asked. A closed carriage entered. 2 men brought the old gentleman inside. He was alive, but unsteady. They took him to the map room. "And you?" I rang the bell and returned below. Later I heard something fall. When I went upstairs, the room was empty. Holmes strode down the corridor. "Show us." The map room overlooked the courtyard. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, except around a long table where several clean arcs showed that objects had recently been moved. On the floor near the hearth, Holmes found a tiny droplet of black wax. The dispatch was sealed here. He examined the fireplace and drew from the ashes a curled scrap of paper bearing part of a handwritten word. "Can you read it?" I asked. "Only the ending, comb." Lestrade stared. Ashcombe? Possibly. Holmes turned toward the wall, where an old bell pull hung beside a faded map of Europe. He tugged it once. Somewhere below, a bell sounded. At the third pull, a soft click came from behind the map. Holmes lifted the frame and revealed a narrow recess. Inside rested a brass key and a fresh white glove, stained at the fingertips with grey powder. "The metal dust from beneath the dead man's nails," I said. Holmes picked up the key. "And the glove belongs to someone who struggled with him." Lestrade reached for it, but Holmes was staring at the key's bow. Engraved upon it were two initials, E.A. "Edmund Ashcombe," said Lestrade. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps." At that moment, a shot cracked from the courtyard below. We rushed to the window. The caretaker lay upon the red gravel, one hand pressed to his shoulder, while a dark-coated figure vanished through the open carriage gate. Holmes was already at the door. "Stay with Voss, Watson!" He seized his hat and sprang into the corridor. "The trap has begun to close, and our murderer has realized it." Holmes disappeared down the staircase with a speed that would have astonished anyone who knew him only as the languid philosopher of Baker Street. Lestrade followed close behind, shouting for the constables stationed at the entrance to secure every exit. I remained beside Abel Voss, whose face had grown ashen beneath the shock of his wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through the fleshy part of his shoulder, and while the injury was painful, I quickly saw that it was not immediately life-threatening. "Steady now," I said, cutting away the sleeve of his coat. "You have been fortunate." Voss clenched his teeth. They meant to silence me. "Then tell me everything while you still have the opportunity." He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. The gentleman who brought the order never removed his gloves. He spoke softly, almost like an educated barrister. But there was something strange about his voice, as though he wished to disguise it. "Did he mention Ashcombe?" "No. The messenger. He called him only the courier, nothing more." As I bandaged the wound, I heard hurried footsteps returning across the courtyard. Holmes entered, breathing only slightly harder than usual, while Lestrade followed with obvious frustration. "He escaped," the inspector said bitterly. "A horse was waiting beyond the square." Holmes removed his gloves with perfect composure. "Not entirely." He opened his hand. Resting upon his palm lay a small brass whistle attached to a broken leather cord. He dropped this while climbing into the carriage. Lestrade frowned. "A whistle? A coachman's signal whistle, handmade." Holmes turned it over. Tiny letters had been engraved along its side. M. Barlow, Lambeth. "The maker?" "Quite so. That cannot identify the owner." "No," Holmes replied calmly, "but it may identify every carriage supplied by the owner." His attention shifted immediately to Voss. "You have been helpful, Mr. Voss. One question remains." The caretaker nodded weakly. "The man who entered with the courier, did he carry anything unusual?" Voss frowned in concentration. "Yes, a walking stick." "What sort?" "A black cane with a silver head, shaped like an eagle." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Not the fashion of an English gentleman," I observed. "Indeed." Holmes slipped the whistle into his pocket. The man anticipated pursuit. "He abandoned nothing of value except this whistle. That tells me he either overlooked it in haste or believed it unimportant." Lestrade folded his arms. "And you believe otherwise?" "I rarely assume coincidence where murder is concerned." Within the hour we had returned to Baker Street. Holmes immediately spread the recovered objects upon the sitting-room table. The silver messenger's button, the hidden strip bearing its cryptic instruction, the brass key marked with Ashcombe's initials, and now the coachman's whistle. For nearly 20 minutes he spoke not a word. He merely arranged the items in different positions, occasionally making notes upon loose sheets of paper. I had learned better than to interrupt such moments, for they represented the silent architecture of his reasoning. At last he stopped. "There are two entirely different conspiracies." I looked up from my chair. "Two?" "Yes." Lestrade, who had remained despite his growing impatience, gave an incredulous laugh. "We have enough difficulty finding one." Holmes ignored the remark. "The first conspiracy concerns the royal message. And the second? The murder." I stared. You believe they are separate crimes. They began separately. He tapped the brass key. This was planted after the murder. To implicate Ashcombe. Precisely. But why? Because whoever arranged the theft wished Scotland Yard to pursue the obvious suspect, while the true objective remained concealed. Lestrade shook his head. You are building castles in the air. Am I? Holmes handed him the key. Notice the engraving. Lestrade examined it. The initials E.A., freshly cut. The inspector looked again. Holmes continued. The surrounding brass has oxidized over many years. The cuts remain bright. Those initials were engraved within the last few days. Lestrade's expression slowly changed. You're right. Therefore, the key itself is old, but the initials are new. To frame Ashcombe. Exactly. Holmes turned to me. Watson, recall Mr. Ashcombe's behavior this morning. He withheld information. Yes, but he came directly to us and voluntarily placed himself under scrutiny. Holmes leaned back. A guilty man rarely seeks out the one individual most capable of exposing him unless forced by circumstance. You think he fears the same enemy? I do. Mrs. Hudson entered quietly with fresh tea, apologizing for the interruption. As she placed the tray upon the table, Holmes's eyes rested briefly upon the folded newspaper she had brought from the hall. Without warning, he seized it. What is it? I asked. He unfolded the front page and scanned a single column. His expression hardened. The murderer has moved sooner than I expected. Lestrade stepped forward. What has happened? Holmes silently handed him the paper. A fresh report occupied the center of the page. Respected antiquarian found dead in his Bloomsbury residence. Police believe death due to sudden illness. Lestrade looked puzzled. An antiquarian? Holmes pointed to the deceased's name. Professor Julian Merrow. I have never heard of him, said the inspector. No, Holmes replied quietly. But the king's forgotten messenger visited him yesterday afternoon. You know that? I noticed a folded appointment card protruding from the dead courier's notebook. It bore only one address, which I committed to memory before the Yard removed his belongings. A heavy silence settled over the room. The official report says natural causes, I observed. Holmes slowly reached for his violin case. And yet I would stake every instrument I possess that Professor Merrow has been murdered. He closed the case with a decisive snap. Come, Watson. Where are we going? To visit a dead scholar whose knowledge has just become more valuable than the document everyone believes was stolen. And with that, we once more descended the stairs of Baker Street, following a trail that had suddenly widened from the murder of a single royal courier into a conspiracy whose true purpose remained hidden behind layers of carefully constructed deception. Professor Julian Merrow's house stood in a narrow Bloomsbury street, where the fog gathered beneath the eaves like smoke trapped beneath a ceiling. We found the front door guarded by a constable, but Lestrade's authority gained us immediate entry. The antiquarian lay in his study, slumped beside a desk upon which several medieval seals had been arranged in orderly rows. Holmes examined neither the body nor the papers at first. Instead, he crossed directly to the fireplace and thrust his hand into the cold ashes. You expected something there? I asked. I expected its absence. He withdrew a fragment of white sealing compound identical to that found in the messenger's ear. Merrow broke the royal seal, said Lestrade. No, he made it. Holmes turned toward the desk. Among the scholar's tools stood a mold containing the crowned lion and messenger's horn. The mystery, which had seemed vast and impenetrable, began to assume a darker shape. Holmes examined Merrow's fingers and found the same minute puncture that had marked the courier's hand. He then lifted a silver-headed walking stick from beside the bookcase. Its handle was carved in the form of an eagle. Our man's cane, I said. Not his cane, Watson. His weapon. With a sharp twist, Holmes removed the silver head. Concealed within the hollow shaft was a narrow, spring-driven needle. Activated by pressure, he explained. A courteous touch upon the hand would be sufficient. The poison causes rapid paralysis of the heart and leaves few outward signs. Lestrade stared grimly at the instrument. Then Merrow murdered the courier. No, Merrow manufactured the false seals and prepared the cipher. He was an accomplice, but he has now been silenced by the man he served. Holmes searched the desk until he discovered a notebook from which one page had recently been torn. Upon the sheet beneath, the pressure of the missing writing remained faintly visible. Using graphite, Holmes revealed an address and a time. Old Royal Mews, 11 o'clock. By 10:30 that night, Lestrade and 2 plainclothes officers were hidden within the abandoned mews near St. James's. Holmes had allowed a carefully worded message to reach Ashcombe, stating that the lost dispatch had been recovered and would be exchanged there for the brass key. Ashcombe himself waited beside us, pale but resolute. "You still suspect me," he whispered. "I suspect that you know more than you have admitted." Ashcombe bowed his head. "The courier was my elder brother." For the first time, his official composure deserted him. He had served the crown for 40 years. "I concealed our relationship because even his identity was protected." "And the document?" Holmes asked. "Contained the names of foreign agents secretly loyal to Britain. If exposed, they would all be murdered." At 11 precisely, 3 bells sounded from a nearby clock tower. A carriage entered the mews. The man who descended wore a dark coat and carried no cane. He approached cautiously, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Holmes stepped into the open. "You are late, Sir Malcolm Vale." The stranger stopped. Ashcombe uttered a cry of recognition. "Vale!" Sir Malcolm was a senior official in the diplomatic service, and a man whose name had appeared frequently in newspapers, beside reports of patriotic speeches and royal ceremonies. "You have no proof," Vale said calmly. "On the contrary, I have an excess of it." Holmes held up the brass whistle. "Your private coachman purchased this from Barlow of Lambeth. The upholstery of your state carriage supplied the blue thread found upon the courier's clothes. Its wheels carried red gravel from the Valdarian legation. You arranged the meeting there because the building's broken royal lion gave meaning to the cipher." Vale's hand moved slowly toward his coat. Lestrade emerged from the shadows. "I should leave that alone, sir." Holmes continued as though nothing had happened. "You required Professor Merrow to copy the courier's seal and compose a false instruction. You then planted the key marked with Ashcombe's initials, hoping to direct suspicion toward the one man capable of identifying the murdered messenger." "The document was never in the dispatch case," Ashcombe murmured. "No," said Holmes. "Your brother anticipated betrayal. He concealed the means of locating it beneath his missing coat button." Vale's expression changed. "The metal wafer," he said. "Precisely. It was a cipher disk. You removed it, but failed to understand that it contained no message. It merely identified where the true document had been placed." Holmes produced the silver button bearing the messenger's horn. The phrase, "The lion carries no crown," referred not only to the legation, but to this emblem. Remove the crowned lion from the design, and the remaining marks form coordinates upon an old map in Merrow's study. The royal dispatch was hidden inside a sealed tube beneath the foundation stone of the King's Messenger Chapel. Vale laughed harshly. "And you expect me to believe you have recovered it?" "I have not." For one astonished instant, no one spoke. Holmes's smile was thin. "But you believed I had. That was why you came." Vale sprang backward and drew a small pistol. Before he could raise it, Ashcombe struck his wrist with his walking stick. The weapon fell, and Lestrade's officers seized him. As the handcuffs closed, Vale's composure finally broke. "You understand nothing," he snarled. "Those agents would have altered the balance of Europe. Their names were worth a kingdom." "To you," Holmes replied, "they were worth money." Documents later recovered from Vale's residence proved that he had negotiated secretly with a foreign power. He had intercepted the courier, tortured him for the location of the list, and killed both him and Merrow when neither could safely be permitted to speak. The dispatch itself was recovered before dawn, exactly where Holmes had deduced. Its contents were delivered unopened into royal custody. Abel Voss survived his wound, while Ashcombe ensured that his brother was buried beneath his true name, though the nature of his service remained unknown to the public. Several evenings later, as Holmes sat playing a melancholy air upon his violin, I expressed my admiration for the chain of reasoning by which he had separated the theft from the murder and exposed a traitor hidden at the heart of government. He lowered his bow. The difficulty, Watson, was not in seeing what was present. Lestrade saw the key, the seal, and the dead men as clearly as I did. Then where did the difference lie? In recognizing what did not belong. A new engraving upon an old key, a false bruise upon a dead throat, and a crown upon a lion that should have carried none. He resumed his music, his lean face calm in the firelight. Deception is rarely perfect, my dear fellow. A lie must borrow something from the truth, and it is in the seam between the two that one finds the murderer.